Thank you for listening to Haladin Music's podcast series on the Baroque era. My name is Sarah Joy, and in today's episode, we will be continuing to discuss the stylistic characteristics of the Baroque era, which was roughly from 1600 to 1750. Now, before we begin, I want to let you know about the beautiful Spotify playlist that Haladin Music put together, where you can listen to the full recordings of the pieces included throughout this series. In the podcast itself, we only include small clips from these pieces, but if you would like to listen to the full recordings, you can do that by listening to that playlist. So in our previous episode, I was discussing the difference between monophony, homophony, and polyphony, as well as talking about basso continuo. In today's episode, I have an additional 7 characteristics that really distinguish this time period from others, particularly the Renaissance period, which is the one that came right before the Baroque era. The first thing on my list is fluidity and freedom, specifically rhythmic freedom. Now, in the Renaissance time period, the main way of writing was polyphonic writing, where you had multiple independent lines happening all at once, different text. There was a lot going on. So you can imagine, as a vocalist in that setting, you did not have much freedom. You had to fit in with everybody else, and if you were off, well, that would that would throw everything off. But with the transition into homophony, and specifically monody being a term for a single vocalist accompanied by basso continuo, what that allowed the single vocalist to do was to take much more rhythmic freedom, because the accompaniment underneath, their role was to follow the main singer. So you can imagine the amount of freedom that came along with that, and the term that was coined during this time, it was sprezzatura, and it basically just means what I've been describing. And you didn't get carried away with the rhythmic freedom necessarily, but there was I want to say, respectful disregard of the meter. But just in general, that introduced much, much more freedom, much more rhythmic fluidity into the music of that time. All right, number 2 on my list, ornamentation. And this, again, is thanks to monody, where the main vocalist did have this freedom and this ability to kind of go off for a little bit and do whatever they want, while the people underneath would just follow along. So a few examples of music ornamentation. You have, I think trill is probably the simplest one to explain. You're going very quickly between the core note and the one above. That would be an example of a trill. Mordents, spelled Mordent. It's kind of a funny word to me. Mordents are whenever you start at your core note and then you go up and then you come back down to the core note. That would be an upper mordent. So a lower mordent would be your core note going a step below and then coming back. Lower mordent. You have turns. So up a note, core note, below the core note, and then back to the core note. Those are just a few examples. And I do actually have a recording example for you to listen to. It includes quite a lot of ornamentation, so that'll give you an even better idea. This is Bach's Orchestral Suite No. 2 in B minor, Movement 1. All right, so number 3 on my list, this is going to be a little bit difficult for me to explain. I don't think I've ever had to really teach this before, but I'm going to do my best. And this is the difference between primarily tonal writing of the Baroque period versus more modal writing of the Renaissance period. Tonal music, that's mostly what we hear today. Major scales, minor scales. But I do want to explain what modes are. And I'm going to do my very best. This is not the most complete way of doing it, but I think it might be the simplest. A major scale consists of the intervallic order of a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And I'm going to actually use the starting note of G. If we were to not change those intervals of the G major scale, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, but instead we start a note up from G, which is A, and we go to the next A, but we're still keeping the same key signature of G major, which is 1 sharp, F sharp. What it sounds like is such a cool sound, right? And that would be called a Dorian mode, the Dorian mode. Last example, this is the Phrygian mode with the intervals of half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole. And then if you just keep going note by note through, you'll encounter the rest of the modes. So number 4 on my list is the freer use of dissonance and voice leading. And the proponents and creators of the newer style were often criticized by the composers that held to the older style. Strict contrapuntal writing, counterpoint has very, very strict rules. And so composers of that style looked at the people who were writing in the more homophonic style, who were more concerned about harmonic progression rather than following the strict rules of counterpoint, and they thought, wow, what sloppy writing, how could you? You're ruining music. Monteverdi actually got a lot of criticism for his use of dissonances and voice leading, and it's actually kind of funny the way that he responded to it. Basically, his response was, look, I'm trained in both the old style and I know what I'm doing with the new style. If you hear something you don't like, I did that on purpose. It wasn't an accident. So mind your own business was, again, that's a paraphrasing of what Monteverdi said, but that was kind of his response. Number 5, when it came to instrumentation, there was quite a difference in the Renaissance period. The kind of music that they would write, it was expected that could either be sung or it could be played by instruments. So they were very interchangeable. But in the Baroque period, they started writing music specifically for instruments and specifically for vocalists. So instead of instruments just playing what the vocalists would sing, they actually had their own special compositions written just for them. And then in terms of the combination of the two, so you would have vocalists and instrumentalists playing together. Instead of the instrumentalists just doubling vocal parts, they would have their own special accompanimental parts that would, support. And there was really interesting interplay between accompaniment and main melody vocal lines. Number 6 has to do with form, or the structure of a piece. As opposed to the more through-written approach of much Renaissance writing, the Baroque composers thought more in terms of repeating sections. Sections at the beginning would come back at the end. There were developments of specific musical ideas that would be repeated throughout the piece in different ways. You had variations. So that was a fairly big difference. Number 7 is program music, pieces that were based on a particular narrative or a singular idea or concept. And I think a very good example of this would be Vivaldi's Four Seasons. All of those were based on the idea of the seasons changing and how we can interpret the specific sounds of those seasons through music and how we can paint pictures with music. So I'm going to go ahead and end this podcast by letting you have a listen to Vivaldi's Concerto No. 4 in F minor. This is Winter, Movement 1. right, that is all for today. In the next episode, episode 4, we'll be talking about the Baroque instruments, how they were built, what makes them different from the instruments that we have today. So I'm very excited for that. Please stay tuned, and thank you for listening.